Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I'd like to welcome you all to the University Centre Owen. This is the second event of this year. My name is Jamie Morgan Green. I'm the Community Hub Manager here at Owen College. The University Centre, for those of you who don't know, opened in January, and it's a partnership between ourselves and the University of Worcester, and obviously we'll be putting on free lectures such as this each month around different topics. We hope the lecturers will inspire you on higher education. And please contact us for more information about courses. So our lecture today is by Joanne Augustus, and she is a Senior Lecturer and Course Leader in Mental Health at the University of Worcester. The lecture is on the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. Now, we'll hand over to Jo shortly, but first, just a little bit of housekeeping. Hopefully, as you all joined, you noticed that your cameras and your microphones are switched off. If you can please continue to be muted throughout the lecture so that we don't have any background noise that might interrupt people. If you have any questions for Jo, we encourage you to use the chat box, and we will do a short Q&A at the end of the lecture. At the bottom right of your screen, you should see a purple tab with arrows, and once you click this, you'll be able to see the chat window. And obviously myself and my colleague, Lottie Summers, will monitor the chat throughout the lecture. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Jo.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Jamie. Can I just double check? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Have you got sound? Just to check.
Yes.
Yep.
Super. Okay. Thank you kindly. Saves me reading a poem or doing a song. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just attempt to share my PowerPoint. So bear with me. Just sharing the screen now. So Jamie or Lottie, could you just confirm for me that you can see my PowerPoint? Jamie or Lottie, could you just confirm if you're still there?
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, super. Okay, thank you kindly. So forgive me, colleagues, and everybody listening today. Technology causes me some anxiety, as I'm sure you can relate to. It's been a huge learning curve, but a very exciting one. So a big welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. As Jamie kindly introduced me, my name is Jo Augustus, and I am a Senior Lecturer in the Department for Health and Wellbeing at the University of Worcester, and I'm very proud to say that I'm in my 6th year there. I'm also a cognitive behaviour therapist, which is a type of psychotherapy. And I started my career in mental health around 18 years ago. And I've worked in a variety of different settings. I'm in primary care and also in inpatient psychiatry. And I guess just kind of taking a little bit of a step back at the moment, one of the reasons that today is such an important lecture is really thinking about the impact of what's happening. And that's something we're going to certainly explore today. So what we do know is that COVID-19 has and is presenting us with numerous challenges to individuals and community psychological well-being. And arguably, we could say that that's one of the biggest challenges the global community has been presented with, certainly this century. And I guess we can kind of see that in a twofold way. The actual threat of the virus, so its contraction, for example, and also the socio-economic consequences of shutdown that was necessary. And from my point of view, mental health is something I'm certainly very passionate about, and thinking about destigmatising mental health in particular. There's a real risk that anxiety becomes embedded in everyday life. So anxiety that's associated with COVID-19. And over a period of time, the risk is that this will have a detrimental effect on people's well-being. And my concern is that people will go through, perhaps despite noticing, early warning signs. And whilst that kind of approach might work for some people, for others, it can quickly lead to what we know as the exhaustion funnel. So, really noticing the impact on the way we think, the way we feel, and in turn our behaviour, which we'll come on to in a moment. And what we do know from experience and research as well is that life is not a constant sprint. We do need to allow for rest and recovery. Emerging from lockdown and the uncertainty around that, and perhaps going back into lockdown in some instances, that can certainly lead to our thoughts spiralling towards anxiety. So that anxiety spiral. And in addition, perhaps we can't do what we've always done. And we can certainly feel fed up as a result. And indeed, we can normalise that to an extent. We know that we're not alone in these experiences. It's certainly a global shared experience. I appreciate that doesn't necessarily make it any easier, or indeed lessen the impact. So those are some of the kind of bases, if you like, of what we're going to talk about today. Super, the PowerPoint works. It's all good. So we're going to start by kind of setting the scene around what is mental health. I think before we think about the impact on mental health, we need to consider what it is. And I should say, as a side note, I do switch between using the phrase mental health and psychological well-being, and ultimately they are the same thing. So bear with me if I slip into that mode. So as we said, we're also going to think about some of the ways that COVID-19 has impacted on mental health, and not forgetting that sort of theoretical approach. Thinking about models to make sense of that shared human experience. And we can't ignore the evidence base to managing the impacts that may be felt. So we'll look towards that as well. And then I've often been asked about further reading, so I'll certainly share some recommendations with you. Okay. So just thinking about that question there. So on the first slide, what is mental health? So I guess one way to explore that is to think about somebody who we might consider as psychologically healthy, and what attributes, what characteristics, what behaviours might they display. So we could see somebody who we deem psychologically healthy as having a high regard perhaps for their strengths, we might call strengths, but also being able to recognise areas that perhaps they're not so good at in life. In recognising what they're not good at, there might be a sense of sharing those responsibilities with other people that are better at it, or seeing it as a development opportunity. So there's something about self-acceptance in there. That person may also recognise that they're able to maintain relationships that meet their needs. So that could be intimate relationships, or friends, family, connections in everyday life. Going to get the newspaper, going to get milk. That sort of sense of having those important connections in our everyday experience. They may also recognise, what psychological needs they actually have in order to maintain their well-being, and also have a sense of kind of independence and freedom in what they do. As a result, they might gain a sense of undertaking tasks that maybe they have to do or want to do, in a sense of gaining achievement and actually enjoying doing those things. So that's who we might recognise as a healthy individual. We must recognise that there are cultural differences in how people might regard themselves as psychologically healthy, and that's something that's certainly emphasised by the World Health Organization. I've put the triangle to the right hand side there just to kind of emphasise that the way we think certainly affects our emotions, or what we might feel at any one moment, and that in turn will affect our behaviours, our actions. And on occasion, that could link to beliefs, beliefs we hold about ourselves, other people around us, and then the world in general. And I'm coming back very much to the link with COVID now. And if we think about occasions when we are finding ourselves becoming anxious and fearful, perhaps in our everyday life experiences, the way we see ourselves, the people and the world in general, is going to be impacted. And that might include, what we do, or indeed what we feel we can choose to do in day-to-day life. So, for example, social isolation, and that's something that the media has certainly discussed at length over this period. And perhaps when people feel isolated, loneliness can occur, particularly when we feel distant from people that are really important to us. And that can lead to a kind of disconnection and further isolation. And I guess the implications of that largely could be us turning towards feeling low in mood, perhaps some anger or frustration at ourselves and maybe others as well. So the impact is very much embedded in terms of how we are in this moment, how we feel connected to other people and the wider community, if you will. There's also been the sort of huge adjustments we've had to make, so thinking about the early days of lockdown, and for example, with what I was doing at home, and that wasn't necessarily really, so I had to make adjustments in terms of how I was, making sure that I had time away from the computer and then back, making sure I was actively connecting, with my colleagues who I'm very fond of, and then thinking about the wider community as well. So I guess thinking about the impact, on a very local level, very, very small example, the level of concentration and associated tiredness, can have a huge impact on our well-being. And then thinking more broadly now, so there's an awful lot of research that's been done, some of which you may be familiar with, and that research has really identified risk factors, that are clearly associated with the pandemic. And they're largely related to kind of broad groups. So just to give you some examples here, there's risk factors in terms of unemployment, or perhaps indeed the threat of unemployment and what that might mean. There's something about housing and income related stress. So, kind of questioning, are we safe? Are we going to have our needs met in terms of a roof over our heads, and so on. There's also something about intimate partner violence. There has been a reported increase in that. And then work-related trauma, and we'll come back to trauma in a work context as well in a moment. And then we certainly can't escape that broad category of grief and loss as well. And that could be directly related to losing a loved one as a result of COVID-19. So we've looked a little bit at some of the broader issues around COVID-19. So in terms of that socioeconomic impact and also perhaps concern of contracting the virus. I guess if we think across somebody's lifetime, we may expect some of these difficulties to occur. We might expect perhaps stresses in regards to finance, let's say, at some point in our lives. So I guess to an extent we could typify this as being part of life experience. However, the difference here is stark in that we're talking about a very concentrated period of time. We're talking 6 months or so. So whilst yes, we can recognise that some of these things are expected, not in this short period. And that is where the risk of somebody's psychological well-being or mental health could deteriorate, or indeed if somebody's got a pre-existing mental health difficulty, that could be exacerbated. Okay, so my students will be absolutely delighted that I've got a model in here. And this is certainly a model I've looked at my students with my students over the years. So if we think about kind of ways to kind of make sense, of what's going on, and whilst I was writing this lecture, what really struck me was the grief cycle. So the grief cycle, and it's also been known as the change curve, something you may have indeed have come across in different contexts, and it's derived from the work of Kubler-Ross. And it kind of describes the internal emotional journey, if you like, that we might typically experiencing when we're dealing with change and transition. And we could say the periods we're in now as change and transition very broadly. And that journey consists of a number of key stages that people go through, from perhaps initial shock or denial, or both, maybe some anger and frustration, and then perhaps moving to a state of like we said, the exhaustion funnel earlier, feeling really low in mood, perhaps through those disconnections. So, really recognising the initial stages of being, really quite emotionally draining and very impactful as a result. And there's a kind of shift in the model, and so those last two stages, so bargaining in the sense of, being able to find meaning, and that can be a really difficult place to be, perhaps if you're in the earlier stages. So meaning in terms of, how else, can we adapt? How else can we live our lives? What else can we have value in as a result? So forgive me giving a personal example again, but I can certainly relate to, being in my local community more than I ever have. And as a result, through my husband and I going on lots of walks in the evenings and weekends, we've seen many more neighbours than we've ever seen before. And we've got those kind of connections now we certainly didn't have in the duration that we've lived here. So I could derive some meaning around, this time that we find ourselves in. Isn't easy by any means. However, I have created some of those new connections that are really important to myself and my husband. And then that last stage around acceptance, and that's certainly not around accepting, we are where we are, and perhaps dismissing any impact. Certainly not. It's something about thinking about, I'm here. There's been an awful lot of difficulties, but which direction do I want to take? Where might I go next with these experiences? And the knowledge that yes, I could attempt to do what I've always done, but is there another opportunity to think, about something else or an alternative? So I guess in summary, the model does go through those sort of changes that we might experience in loss and change, or indeed grief, as the title suggests. It's important to recognise that this isn't a linear process. It's something that we can go back down through, or maybe go from one point to another. There's something about understanding these experiences through the lens of this model that may be helpful. So one other thing I just wanted to mention with this slide also is, there's certainly a percentage of the population that might find themselves, really stuck in perhaps one stage, of the Kubler-Ross model. So, for example, maybe the depression, point, the low mood, not enjoying things that perhaps they once did. And, as a result, they might find themselves finding that their mental health is deteriorating in perhaps one or more areas. And one of those areas, could be what we could frame as traumatic or trauma. And I really wanted to mention that here today with you. I think sometimes we can get stuck on the notion that trauma is perhaps limited to war zones or conflict. I think it's really important to recognise that trauma kind of exists, as many mental health problems do, on a continuum of intensity. So, if we think that, broadly speaking, thinking that trauma by definition is being exposed, to a really difficult or horrific event, or something that maybe somebody might deem very threatening or life-threatening. Perhaps if we think about the current circumstance through that lens, maybe you can identify that maybe some of the things you've experienced or others, near to you have experienced, kind of traumatic type symptoms. And I should sort of note with you now that doesn't mean you've got post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's just a way of understanding, our responses. So you might find that, perhaps something triggers, a sense of maybe the trauma that you experienced, or maybe there's, a flashback of actually what happened, or maybe you're taken back to a point in your history many years ago that could be uncomfortable. And sometimes we relive that historic experience as if it was happening in the moment. So I guess, viewing some of our current experiences through the sort of lens of trauma or adversity, can be quite a helpful one. And I mentioned a moment ago, about work-related trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder has also been linked to difficulties at work, and particularly specific to frontline workers. So that could be emergency workers. It could be people that working in environments that are very busy, very stressful, and perhaps even more so in the current climate. We might consider those individuals, psychologically at risk. And remembering that, again, it's not just about it being isolated to one particular group of individuals, like emergency services. It could be an experience that somebody's had, in a very different workplace, so that the kind of hidden workplaces, if you like. So I think it's really important to remember, other employees as well, and work-based settings. I'm very aware that workplaces in the last 5 or so years have, really taken what we might call a trauma-informed care approach. So, really educating staff, employees, and those connected to organisations to recognise, common traumatic stress reactions and, common responses that we all might make, to a traumatic experience. So having that awareness, can be really helpful, and having that understanding, isn't about saying we need to get somebody a diagnosis. It's noticing that somebody, might need a bit more support, perhaps that they're frightened to ask, in that particular moment. So, signposting those individuals could be really helpful. Okay. So one thing just to touch on as well, and I'll come back to this in a moment, is that principle of post-traumatic growth. So with regard to the Kubler-Ross model, I mentioned about acceptance, that last stage, and how we can move forward, in terms of any learning from the difficult experiences we're currently experiencing. And what we do know is, research has shown that many people do find that kind of personal growth, if you like, in the aftermath of a traumatic experience. And that might include, very broadly, greater appreciation of life, maybe having different priorities. It opens up other possibilities for individuals in their current situation or indeed future. And there are also those kind of psychological shifts, if you like, in the way that we think and the way that we see the world. So I think it's a broader possibility, if you like. So from a difficult experience, we can have growth. Equally, it's very important to emphasise that this won't be everyone's experience. Some people may be really struggling for whatever reason. The pandemic certainly does pose some significant challenges, as we started off by saying. In particular, it can really impact on how how individuals understand the world and their place in it. So just moving up the slide there, a couple of other things to be aware of, as consequences of trauma are around compassion fatigue. So people that perhaps have prolonged exposure to trauma or trauma experiences, can start re-experiencing and avoiding, feeling intense anxiety and related symptoms. Secondary trauma can also be present, that sort of acute reaction. And sometimes people might be experiencing other people's trauma. So if you are currently listening to the different people's traumatic stories, you might find yourself kind of reliving their stories. So again, things to be aware of. And that phrase burnout that's quite controversial, that again you may have come across, that reaction to a really demanding job and environment of that job. So really recognizing the emotional drain, if you will, on some jobs, some careers. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the reactions that we might have from the pandemic, and I just want to shift focus a little bit in the second part to those evidence-based approaches, and by evidence-based I mean perhaps interventions or approaches that have been developed as a result of many years of research, and those research approaches, if you like, have found certain interventions to be effective. So those evidence-based interventions are designed, if you will, to prevent mental health disorders, and there's something about recognising whether some of those could be helpful in the here and now, in the current climate. So again, if we take a step back a moment, if we see some of the possible approaches to the pandemic, we could really see those as two-pronged as well. And I've got a model to show you in a moment on the next slide. But before I do, just to mention, so if we think about that two-pronged approach, so almost mimicking the sort of public health response that's been taken. So really highlighting what needs to happen in the immediacy, what needs to happen right now for people that are displaying symptoms that they perhaps can't manage on their own. And then the second pronged approach is to really think about, okay, what are the broader public health issues? And I guess in taking that two-pronged approach, we're kind of taking a focus that is prevention and strengthening. So we're taking a model that acts to both prevent the deterioration of anybody's mental health and also supporting their ability to cope. It could also be effective for people who have got pre-existing mental health difficulties as well, and prevent further deterioration or indeed stabilising their particular difficulties. And of course, we can't forget that there are many excellent community-based services that are already available, and including resources as well for people that might want to access mental health. So, again, there's lots of different things that are available, and not forgetting workplaces as well. Often workplaces will provide support for mental health, and that's done in many different ways, whether it's self-help or self-care strategies, or whether it's actual interventions that are provided. Okay, so this is the model that I referred to. So forgive the busy nature, and this was one that was it appeared on Twitter actually back in March, and it really caught my eye as being very relevant, and I hope it's okay to share it with you today. It's also been referenced in a couple of journal articles that I found. So that two-pronged approach, there's certainly something about that first prong, if you like. What public health measures do we immediately need to put in place? And as we move away from sort of that curve peaking, thinking about the sort of preventative strategies that could be put in place. And if we see an approach, a public health approach to mental health, we can kind of adopt the same strategy. So at the moment we could and are as a community, highlighting the impact, of mental health as a result of COVID, having these discussions today, for example. But also thinking about some of the unhelpful coping strategies that we might have used historically, and therefore what we can do now, to mitigate that. So healthy eating, making sure that we are getting plenty of fresh air, making sure that we are connecting with people, limiting triggers, to anxiety, which I'll come back to in a moment. So arguably we're recognizing that mental health difficulties could and are escalating, but actually by putting these things in place we can again flatten that curve and lower that peak. And there's also something about looking at what resources are available, and using those most effectively within our communities. Okay. So just drawing on the triangle that I showed you earlier on, so that triangle, around thoughts, emotions, and then behaviour. I certainly emphasised that the way we think, affects the way we feel, and in turn, affecting our behaviour. So just focusing in on the moment at thinking or thoughts. Often it's quite difficult to pinpoint what we're thinking at any one moment, and that could be for a variety of reasons. So in the run up to starting this presentation, my thoughts were very much on how's the technology going to be? Is my Wi-Fi going to be stable enough? Are the listeners going to have a good experience? So my thoughts were very focused on you and thinking about you getting out of the presentation today what you could with the appropriate technology infrastructure. But I'm aware that if I took that to an extreme, I could feel quite anxious as a result, which could then affect the way I engage with you, could affect my physical well-being. So I guess what I'm emphasising here is one of the things we can do is notice. So noticing perhaps where our thoughts are right now. So just pausing a moment and maybe allowing yourself to tune in to, what are you thinking? What's going through your mind? And I think if we do that, then we might be quite shocked at how much of our thoughts or thinking patterns are on a loop. So a loop. And then noticing maybe how judgmental they are. And equally the impact of this. And then noticing perhaps how draining that could be. So if we notice, pause, then noticing that sort of thought spiral, if you like, we can make a choice, a choice to kind of broaden our awareness to what else is in our immediate environment. So rather than maybe getting caught in my own thoughts, I'm kind of externalizing myself, if you will. So just some examples I've got on the slide here, and just letting you into a secret, these are certainly some of my my thinking patterns that I can identify with, and I'm wondering if you can as well. So that critical self, really noticing that sort of critical thought pattern we all might have, around doing things more, better, faster, and so on. Maybe noticing as an alternative that, here we go again, here's that internal bully. Is there another way that I could think about a particular situation? Or can I choose, as I said earlier, to kind of redirect my attention somewhere else? And then the last one I'll mention before moving on is that word catastrophizing. Don't ask me to spell it, the catastrophizing. So, if I'm constantly thinking the worst case scenario, if I'm constantly looking at social media that might tell me, that there is a worst case scenario and it's happening, possibly I'm going to get very caught up in that narrative, that account. Could I look at other possibilities? So just in terms of those other possibilities, it's got a slide or two about worry and uncertainty. So kind of focusing on what we can control, what we can do in terms of a choice we might make. So, we know that the pandemic has created a lot of uncertainty. There can be periods of loneliness and isolation in many parts of our lives. If we can slow things down, perhaps moment to moment, and almost make a choice, that choice I mentioned earlier, a choice to focus our attention. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to engage our senses. So, for example, being really curious about what I can hear. So, really noticing the different layers of sound. So perhaps birdsong outside is an example. So, really noticing the distance between myself and the birdsong. So if we kind of imagine that our attention is a bit like a beam of light, a torch, those old-fashioned torches, or perhaps you can still get them, that you kind of turn and it really focuses one way, and if you turn it the other way, it kind of broadens out, that perspective. So we can narrow and broaden, that torch beam, of our awareness, and in doing so, we can really then take steps to, to do other things to take care of ourselves, whatever that might be. So, specific to worry now, I've highlighted a couple of steps. So, the first one is very specific to noticing, what's here, and acknowledging, any worry. There's also an opportunity to kind of reframe, and by that I mean sometimes there are things that we can't challenge, we can't find an alternative perspective, and worry is kind of one of those, because often it's very future focused. But we still could recognise that worry doesn't define us. Worry is a kind of normal evolutionary response. Moving on, we could also postpone worry. So perhaps noticing when you are worrying, acknowledging, perhaps recording it if that's okay for you, and then postponing it. And by postponing it, I mean that fourth step, scheduling worry time. So perhaps at 5 p.m. in your day, maybe for 30 minutes, you'll really focus on some of those worries that you've established through the day, and then establishing if they are, and what we recognise as a real problem or a hypothetical worry. So, real problems are things that we can do something about, in the near future, or perhaps now. And then those hypothetical worries are those future-facing things that we cannot do anything about at the moment, and finding ways to let go, of those worries, could be helpful. And by no means is that meant to undermine the intensity of those worries, because they are very distressing. But if we can organise them into real problems and hypothetical worries, that could give us a way to manage them, respond to them differently. And often people ask, how can I let worries go? They're so intense, they're so difficult sometimes, and absolutely, I really appreciate that. I mentioned earlier about engaging our senses. So, in other words, redirecting our attention. We could do that by what I've put there, grounding, and literally grounding us in the here and now, kind of anchoring us to the present moment, rather than getting caught in the future, or perhaps ruminating about the past. And engaging our five senses, again, is one way to do that. There's also something about self-compassion. So, really acknowledging that, the anxiety, the worry, or the low mood that we're experiencing, is really tough. Being human's really tough, generally, let alone at the moment. But if we can attend to those with kind of kindness and with compassion, so, maybe speaking to ourselves in a different way. Perhaps that's something that you don't often notice, but sometimes do you notice yourself perhaps becoming very critical of something you've done or not done. And as an alternative, could we turn down the volume of that kind of self-talk we have, or inner dialogue, call it what you will. Could we soften it a little? Could we, kind of acknowledge that the sort of function of worry is because we are concerned? And often I'll discuss when I'm teaching mindfulness that there's a really good metaphor around the first arrow and second arrow, and this might be something you've come across before. So if we think medieval England now, bear with me, and we imagine that we can see an arrow, literally a wooden arrow with a metal tip coming towards us, and we can see it at the corner of our eye, and then it very quickly comes into our full vision. And there's kind of nothing we can do about it. It's gonna make contact. It's gonna hit us, and maybe it wounds us. Maybe it hits my arm, and maybe it pierces my skin. There's blood, and it hurts. So the first arrow that comes in really represents that kind of raw pain, that we feel, and that raw pain, could be actual pain. Maybe it's also that kind of emotional pain that we feel. But then before long, again, out of the corner of my eye, I can just see another arrow coming in. And that other arrow is coming in at the same pace, and it's kind of it's poised to come in the same position, and again it hits me. But the difference with the second arrow is me adding meaning. So me saying it's my fault that arrow came in. How stupid am I? It was meant to hit me. So that dialogue we often have being our fault. So again, noticing that when the first arrow comes in, what can we do to take care of ourselves? And what can we do to kind of bat that second arrow away, so that we can attend, to the actual raw pain that we feel, rather than adding extra meaning, to that initial pain. So I hope that's helpful as a metaphor. And that really relates to the last point there, thinking about, reframing, the way we might think about a situation, and remembering, that this isn't an easy task, but it's something to perhaps consider if it's right for you. Okay, so just a point on thinking and sensing. So I've mentioned this a few times now. So the way we think affects our emotional self and in turn our behaviours. And at this stage, I think a good place to start is to recognise the degree to which our psychological well-being, or our mental health and levels of happiness, if you will, are shaped by where we have our attention. So if we think that often we get very stuck in our thought processes, the theatre of our minds, a drama that plays out in our mind's eye, and it's got us at the centre stage before we even know it. And that drama is unfolding around us, perhaps while we're quite helpless in managing how it plays out. So generally our attention is kind of hijacked. It's hijacked by the most intense experience we're having in any moment. We've got a choice to notice when that hijacking is happening, or when the theatre has put us centre stage of a drama that isn't even our own. We can direct our attention to our sensory experience. So that present moment awareness of what we can see, hear, taste, smell and feel around us. And that doesn't remove the thoughts. The thoughts are still there, but it lessens arguably the intensity of them, and it opens up other possibilities. So again, by kind of playing with focusing that torch beam that I mentioned earlier, does that impact on on levels of happiness, if you will, and our psychological well-being? So some of those principles are taken from mindfulness, and I appreciate you know, you may have come across this yourself. You know, it's kind of out there at the moment, and that can be helpful and unhelpful. You know, unhelpful because, you know, mindfulness isn't right for everybody, and helpful for those that might be interested, you know, in exploring it as a possibility. Okay, so just coming to the last slide or two. So this slide is really getting us to think about, again, those evidence-based approaches around moving away from what could be deemed unhelpful. And, you know, worry is sometimes helpful, but, you know, I'm really, you know, shining the torchlight on when it's unhelpful, when perhaps it's becoming draining and it's affecting, you know, our physical health or perhaps our behaviours. And these principles are based on the 5 ways to well-being that you may be familiar with. So, you know, ensuring that we set a routine and giving ourselves permission to set a routine with things that, you know, keep our mind and body active, things that, you know, we've got to do, perhaps like housework, but also things that, you know, give us a sense of mastery and, you know, an enjoyment as well. You know, really recognising when, you know, we do you know, provide or you know, are kind to other people. So, you know, whether that's asking how somebody is in the street, or, you know, making sure that, you know, you engage with a good friend of yours to perhaps meet their needs. You know, really acknowledging those achievements are really helpful, and something that perhaps we're not always very good at doing consistently. There's also something about noticing and limiting things that trigger worry. So, you know, social media, news, perhaps, you know, just being curious about limiting some of those and just seeing if it, you know, lessens any anxiety you might be experiencing. And then lastly, you know, we know that we have to physically distance. What we also know is that we don't have to socially isolate. So, you know, really finding creative ways to speak to people that, you know, are really important to us, family and friends, and making sure that we assign, you know, time in our days, our busy days, you know, to do this. And finally, so this is a quote that I found that I really wanted to share with you from Brené Brown, and I think she, you know, she really encapsulates a lot of the things we've spoken about today. It's really awkward, kind of doing what we're doing at the moment in the pandemic, you know, not being able to hug friends and family, for example. There's also an element of us really being brave, you know, as a result, and kind to ourselves, others, and the world in general, remembering not to do it alone. And then my very last slide, apart from my references, is some recommended books. You know, if you did want to do a bit more reading around perhaps specific mental health difficulties or mindfulness. Often I've been asked questions about you know, helping children and young people. So there's some examples there. And you'll also notice the Overcoming series of books, so Overcoming Anxiety, for example. They're all available in the local libraries, I understand. And if you're interested in mindfulness, then the book there, the turquoisey book that's called Finding Peace in a Frantic World, is quite a good introductory text if you're interested in and perhaps haven't done any reading before. And it's also got some free tracks to download and listen to. At the top left, you may be aware that if you did want to access more support, the local NHS service is available, and you can contact your GP for further details, but you can also self-refer, and I've put the details there. Then there's some other websites as well, just for other resources if you wish. And I understand this is being recorded, and the slides will be made available again if you would like them. So I'm going to hit the pause button on my presenting now, and I want to sort of give a bit of time and space for any questions that might have appeared. Lottie, are you there? Hello, Lottie.
Hello.
Hello.
Me and Jane.
Hello.
Surprise.
Yeah, honestly, thank you so much for that, Jo. Obviously, fascinating, to hear about that, and obviously, it's so kind of important and prominent at the moment, especially with especially with the organisation that we're in, having not seen so many people, whether it be our colleagues or our students, for so many months, and
Absolutely.
and then coming back and just trying to deal with some sort of normality, but not quite, because obviously with sort of second lockdown and everything else coming, it is very difficult for them to get a handle on kind of where they are and what their position is, and just how to kind of behave as well. It's ever changing with different rules for different regions. We have a question.
Of course.
The question is from Savannah. It says, what would you recommend for older adults that aren't able to use technology to keep connected during a pandemic?
That's such a good question. Thank you so much, Savannah. And it's a really tough one, particularly when we are so reliant on technology, and today being a really good example. And it's helpful in one sense because we can have these conversations, but it also could be limiting for other people. And I guess there's something about thinking of almost, excuse the phrase, but old-fashioned values of the community. So if we think about before computers, how did we connect with people? Well, I can remember being a young child and looking at notice boards with my grandma, in terms of what's going on in the local community. I can remember looking at other sort of notice boards that were around. Now the big difficulty with that is we know things have been postponed, cancelled. Going to a yoga class, for example, it is really difficult at the moment. If that's something you're used to doing. But what we can do is reach out to those community-based organisations and see how they are adapting, and then engage if we feel it's the right thing for us to do. So, for example, I live in South Gloucestershire. I appreciate many of you are much further north than I am. I'm very aware in my local community there's a lot of outdoor activities, weather permitting. The weather's just cleared here by the look of it, that people can engage in. And also I'm aware there's a lot of pop-up things that are happening, in tents and so on, that are within the guidelines. There's also making sure that we are scheduling time, to kind of be with those that are near and dear to us, whether that is through the telephone, or whether that is through, if it's possible, another interaction like a socially distanced walk. But also knowing that there are still community services available is really important. And that the final thing that I said on Wednesday, the other talk I did, is nobody ever regrets asking for help, because you can always decline it. I'm very aware people do regret not asking for help. And help can be, kind of a strong word. By that I mean, just saying, I'm struggling or I'm lonely, and perhaps to GP practice, and I'm confident that they will have some suggestions, for a starting point. Or doing the same to a community centre. You can do it anonymously, if that feels okay for you. So I guess the bottom line is just making sure that you ask. People won't know if you don't say, and I know that that's really tough, and it's that word brave, on the Brené Brown slide earlier, or finding somebody you trust that can do it for you. So I'm really hoping that answers the question, Savannah.
I think it's definitely a very interesting question, and I've just found out that in the past couple of weeks, an example really of where communities have come together. We work with an organisation called Hallis Homes, which is it's a charity, and it's a daycare centre and residential for adults with learning difficulties and special needs. And what they've had to do is they had a round of kind of fundraising, and what they've done is they've adapted some of their buildings to kind of have almost, it's almost like a, it's like a conservatory that has kind of secure glass, so that at least visitors and artists and kind of creative people that used to come in can still come in and kind of do kind of workshops with residents in a very kind of safe, controlled way. So I think that you are right, even just keeping in touch with organisations and looking at how they're adapting and taking positive ideas and kind of feeding them into other organisations is quite important.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Jamie. I think that's a really important point to raise, and I guess I've got the phrase in my head, make us work. In terms of those service providers out there, pick up the phone. They have the expertise, and if you're not able to pick up the phone, then making sure that there's somebody that can do that for you or with you.
Another that I've just thought of is, what kind of lessons do you think we can take from what's happened so far within this pandemic in terms of what we might be faced with kind of in the future? I think there's anything that we can learn from what's happened or hasn't happened so far in terms of maybe how we approach the future or adapt?
That's a really good question, Jamie, and I think we're learning all the time. But in terms of learning, since the 23rd of March this year, there's certainly something about adapting to the new environments that we find ourselves in, not feeling that we have to just put up and not ask for help. I think there's also something about recognizing it's okay to not be okay, that phrase that's often used, but equally knowing we're not on our own. I think often we can get caught in what we can't do, because that's often what we're told, with good reason. There's a lot of science to say we shouldn't be doing certain things. That doesn't mean we cannot try alternatives that are safe and effective. So I think that there's big learning to have this specific to mental health, and I think sometimes knowing that we're not on our own can be really powerful.
It's actually interesting what you just said there, because another question from Abby, and she was saying that when she asks for help, you can often feel weak. And you feel weak because you're for help, and it's how can you kind of overcome that? And I think, like you said, kind of going with your feelings and thinking, well, it's okay not to be okay, as you said.
Absolutely, and Abby's made such a good point that I can relate to that as well. Saying to my one of my colleagues who I'm very, very fond of earlier, can you just repeat that? I didn't quite understand what you meant. I was busy typing as she was talking to me, and bless her, she slowed down and she went through it again with me, and I had that sort of instant reaction: should I ask her? Should I not? So that sense of what's she going to think of me if I ask her to tell me that thing again? So I think that can certainly play out in everyday life. I'm certainly not immune, neither are you, Jamie. So perhaps, Abby, some of the strategies that I mentioned earlier might be okay for you to try. I'm not saying you should by any means, but being curious about noticing when our kind of inner bully creeps in, and just seeing if we could open up another possibility. Could we challenge that inner bully, or could we focus our attention somewhere else? And that might facilitate us then to try something different, to take care of ourselves.
We've had a question from Matt, who's from Stellar Mind UK, and it was to do with the grief cycle, and he says it's sort of a question within a question. So if one notices an individual jumping throughout the first 3 stages, anger, depression, hostility, the grief cycle, is there anything we can do to help them along or through the process, or is it a case of monitoring the situation and working at their own pace?
Oh, that's a really great question. Thanks, Matt. I think that there's definitely something about taking an individualized approach, and sometimes actually sharing that grief model with somebody can be really empowering. So I mentioned I'm a cognitive behavior therapist as well. I might actually share that model with some of my clients to kind of give them an understanding of what's happening. and in doing so, that might highlight that awareness they might have of where they are going back and forwards, perhaps sometimes, minute to minute, or sometimes it might be slower. And in having that awareness, that might prompt them to think, yeah, maybe I could access some support. But ultimately, that's the decision for them, to make. What we do know from experience is the people are more likely to access help if they realise it of their own accord than us telling them. But there's no reason why we couldn't hypothetically talk. So for example, somebody who is is really depressed and perhaps has that diagnosis, or has some of those symptoms over a long period of time, we could say that there are various evidence-based approaches to support you in that. Would that interest you? And that's the kind of opportunity, if they say yes, to then signpost. Or if they're not ready, it's kind of just acknowledging that, I really thank you for being honest with me, and possibly they will come back, at some point, and be able to access those, those resources. So I think with anybody that we encounter, the best thing we can do is kind of be alongside them and listen to what's going on, and then signpost appropriately. And then it's up to them, what they do. And of course, there are variations to that, particularly if risk is present. We might have a duty of care depending on where we work to act. But predominantly, if we can just be alongside that person on their journey and trying to get them to identify which journey direction do they want to take, perhaps rather than focusing on the destination.
It's interesting actually, because Matt's kind of extension question actually relates to your answer there, because he said, we're discussing the Google process help, and then perhaps bringing to light stages that may help individuals recognise their own feelings.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's such a good point, Matt. Thank you ever so much for that.
Okay, so we haven't had any more questions, so I'll just kind of generally sort of finish up here. So thank you again, obviously, Jo, for the talk. To the audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's session. If you would like any more information about the university and Halesowen, or study in HG at Halesowen College or at the University of Worcester, you can contact our community hub assistant, who is Lottie Summers, and her email is lsummers@halesowen.ac.uk, and that will be contained in some of the information that's already been sent to you. We have another lecture on Thursday the 26th November, a very different topic, the next one. It's to do with the outcome of the US election and its impact on US-UK relations. So if you were interested in that, and I appreciate it's a very different topic, you can obviously visit the Halesowen College website, and you will be able to book tickets on that. Yeah, I think that's kind of everything, really. The session has been recorded. We will send you a copy of the recording or a link to it to the audience, and obviously please feel free to share that with your colleagues or other individuals who might appreciate it. So that's it from myself and Lottie. To leave the session, if you just want to use the menu at the top left of your screen, and then you can leave the session from there. But thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you to Lottie, and also to Henry.